In 1976, a Hollywood film crew was setting up a set in a Carnival funhouse. As they were moving a neon orange wax mannequin prop that was hanging from a noose, the arm snapped off in the producer's hand. But it didn't break like plastic. It snapped like dry wood. The crew expected to see cheap, broken plastic, but what the producer was holding in his hand wasn't a prop. It was the arm of a man who had been dead for 66 years. The TV production crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man inside a rundown amusement park in Long Beach, California. The episode was called Carnival of Spies, and it required a dark, unsettling carnival environment, which made the location an easy choice. The attraction was called Laff in the Dark. It was a funhouse filled with outdated props, flickering lights, and old dusty decorations that no one had bothered to replace in years. And among those decorations was a hanging prop. It was life-sized, stiff, and slightly discolored, just like an old mannequin. It was slumped and it hung from a noose. The production crew didn't think twice about it. They assumed it was just another cheap horror prop, until someone tried to move it. As a crew member reached up to reposition the figure, the arm snapped off at the shoulder. The set went completely silent as they realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. Muscle tissue was still visible inside the break. The arm had snapped clean off like an old piece of wood, exposing bone. Real human bone. Filming stopped immediately, and the authorities were called. What the crew had assumed was a mannequin turned out to be a real human corpse that had been hanging inside the funhouse for years. Inside the mouth, investigators found two baffling clues: a 1924 penny and a ticket stub from a traveling sideshow dating back to the 1920s. The body belonged to Elmer McCurdy, a man whose discovery raised the chilling question: how does a human being end up as a plastic carnival prop? To answer that, you have to go back more than 60 years, with a man who was arguably the most incompetent outlaw in the American history. This guy makes the wet bandits from Home Alone look like certified geniuses. In the storied history of Wild West outlaws, most bandits are remembered for their daring heists and bravery. But McCurdy isn't remembered for his crimes. He's remembered for his total lack of talent. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a walking disaster who couldn't even break the law correctly. Elmer McCurdy was born in 1880 in Washington, Maine. He grew up poor, he drifted from place to place, and he worked a series of jobs that never quite worked out. But eventually, he joined the US Army, where he learned how to use explosives, including nitroglycerin. This training would later convince McCurdy that he was qualified to become an outlaw, but history would disagree. After leaving the military, McCurdy headed west and settled briefly in Oklahoma. And like many struggling men at the turn of the 20th century, McCurdy started to believe that crime might be easier than honest work. He wanted to be an outlaw, but someone forgot to tell him he wasn't very good at it. Elmer McCurdy desperately wanted to become a legend, but he had one small problem. He was almost comically bad at crime. During one heist, he attempted to blast open a safe using his nitroglycerin training from the Army. But Elmer wasn't great with explosives, and he butchered the job. He used so much nitro that he didn't just open the safe, he blew up the coins inside, melting $40,000 worth of silver coins directly into the metal walls. He'd technically broken in, but he made the coins inside completely worthless. But McCurdy was unfazed. He eventually went after the big one, a train rumored to be carrying $400,000 in government payments. It was supposed to be a life-changing, retirement-level heist, but in classic Elmer fashion, he stopped the wrong train. So instead of the treasure chest of gold he expected, he mistakenly boarded a passenger train, walking away with $46 and 2 jugs of whiskey. Most outlaws leave behind a legacy of fear and respect. Elmer McCurdy left behind a pile of melted silver and a very confused sheriff. If there was an award for the worst outlaws in history, Elmer wouldn't have just won it. He would have accidentally blown up the trophy. Despite a string of failures, McCurdy refused to quit, but eventually the law caught up with him and a bounty was issued on his head. In October of 1911, a sheriff's posse finally tracked him to a hayloft in Oklahoma. They surrounded the barn, calling for his surrender, but Elmer knew this was his final chance at a heroic outlaw moment, and he refused to go quietly. A frantic shootout erupted in the darkness, and when the smoke finally cleared, the 31-year-old lay dead with a single bullet wound to his chest. that should have been the end of the story. But for Elmer McCurdy, death wasn't the end of the line. It was the beginning of his world tour. McCurdy's body was taken to a funeral home in Oklahoma. No family came forward to claim him, and in the early 1900s, it was common for undertakers to embalm unclaimed bodies heavily while waiting for burial arrangements. So McCurdy was embalmed, heavily. Days passed, then weeks. No one claimed the body. The undertaker decided he wasn't going to eat the cost of preserving the body himself, so he made a business decision. McCurdy's body was dressed in street clothes. A rifle was placed in his hands, and he was propped upright inside the funeral home. A sign was posted next to him, advertising him as the Wild West bandit who wouldn't give up. Visitors were charged a nickel to see him, and the coins were dropped directly into his mouth. McCurdy was finally gaining the notoriety and riches he desperately wanted. It's just too bad he wasn't alive to see it. Then in 1916, two men arrived at the funeral home claiming to be Elmer McCurdy's long-lost brothers. They said they wanted to give him a proper burial, so the undertaker handed over the body. But the men weren't his brothers. They weren't relatives at all. They were carnival promoters. They'd heard of the bandit who wouldn't give up, and they knew they could make a pretty penny from his corpse. Instead of burying McCurdy, they placed him into a traveling sideshow. He was advertised as a real American outlaw, preserved and upright. He'd finally achieved what he was never able to manage in real life. He became a legendary outlaw. And from that moment on, Elmer McCurdy began his second life, one that would last far longer than his first. For the next 60 years, Elmer McCurdy did more traveling as a corpse than he ever did as a living man. He became a permanent fixture in the American Carnival circuit. He bounced between traveling carnivals, dusty wax museums, and roadside horror attractions. Ownership changed hands repeatedly, and the original story blurred into legend. But as the decades passed, his preserved corpse began to fail. His fingers snapped off, his toes eventually crumbled, his ears vanished entirely. So to keep the attraction viewer-friendly, owners layered him in thick wax and coats of neon paint. They patched his deteriorating frame until he looked less like a human being and more like a mannequin. By the time he reached his final destination inside the funhouse, the paperwork was long gone, and the truth about Elmer McCurdy had been buried. Everyone involved had forgotten one detail that mattered the most. The prop hanging from the noose wasn't a masterpiece of art. It was a real person. By the time the 1970s arrived, Elmer McCurdy had transitioned from a star attraction to a forgotten prop. He was no longer the bandit who wouldn't give up. He was coated in fluorescent paint and hung from a noose inside the Laff in the Dark funhouse in Long Beach, California. And for years, thousands of screaming teenagers walked right past him, never realizing that the mannequin in the corner was actually a man in the corner. The legend finally ended in 1976 when that television crew for the $6 Million Man arrived to film. When investigators finally performed the most overdue autopsy in history, they found more than just a 65-year-old gunshot wound. Wedged inside Elmer's mouth, as if he were some sort of gumball machine, were two final clues: a 1924 penny and a ticket stub from a 1920s sideshow. After 66 years of being sold, painted, and ignored, Elmer McCurdy was finally more than just a prop. He was recognized as a person again. In 1977, Elmer McCurdy was finally laid to rest in Oklahoma. A judge ordered that 2 feet of concrete be poured over his casket to keep him from ever being taken advantage of again. Elmer McCurdy failed miserably as an outlaw, but in death, he succeeded as a tourist attraction, a movie prop, a TV show extra, and a historical punchline. His story is real, it's documented, and it's one of the clearest examples of how absurd reality can become. This isn't legend. This is sick history.